Hi, everybody. This is Phil from Brentwood Christian Church, and welcome to the inaugural Talking Church podcast hosted by Brentwood. Today is also our first episode in a series with Ally Henny, Brentwood's theologian in residence. I begin the conversation by asking Ally to reflect a bit on how anti-racist work should not be placed on the back burner in the midst of the current coronavirus crisis, and then we turn our attention to the ways that Christians can be responsible during this time, including the importance of loving our neighbor precisely by not gathering for worship this Easter. We hope you enjoy our conversation. You can keep up with our podcast and more at brentwoodchristianchurch.com. And if you're interested in worshiping with us, we are live streaming at brentwoodchristianchurch.tv every Sunday morning at 10 o'clock a.m. Central Standard Time.
Well, I think it was Malcolm X who said that when white America gets a cold, black America gets pneumonia. So a lot of this, I think that is actually an apt comparison, because a lot of coronavirus, COVID-19, it definitely started out as a disease of white privilege. And what I mean by that is that it's the white people, for the most part, who were international travelers, who were in different places, particularly Italy and in Spain and in France, where this disease was, that people, overseas travelers coming home with the disease, us not knowing a whole lot about it, our government being briefed on it, but not responding in a way that would have been appropriate to help stop some of the spread of this, that you have some of these affluent white folks who caught this disease and are spreading it. And I think that there was even a case in St. Louis, and I hate to name St. Louis and call St. Louis out in this and call these specific people out in this way, but it was some people from an affluent suburb of St. Louis whose daughter, I believe, had gone to Italy, come back home. People in her family were infected. They decided to not heed the advice of medical professionals who told them to quarantine. They went all over their little affluent suburb of St. Louis, and people got infected from what I understand. And I'm assuming that people got infected. Maybe they didn't get infected, but just even the audacity of going out and going out whenever you're supposed to be under quarantine and doing all these things. So I say, it was a disease at first of white privilege in a lot of ways. But unfortunately, what you have in Chicago, people that were workers at O'Hare Airport, and I think it even was at Midway Airport too. I remember first seeing Chicago news, and they're like, "Oh, coronavirus is at O'Hare." And I was like, "What? What does that even mean? Like, what is coronavirus?" But anyway, it was affecting a certain echelon of people. But as transmission goes, and as disease transmission goes, it's ended up, and it's not quite hit certain marginalized communities quite yet, but it's definitely coming. And so this becomes an issue of social justice whenever you get into, I just saw a story on CNN today of a Black woman who, I think it was on CNN, it was either on CNN, I've been watching CNN all day, it was either on CNN or I saw it on my phone, I can't remember now, so I probably shouldn't cite CNN because that wasn't it. Somebody's gonna be like, oh, somebody's like pull receipts, like, this never was on CNN, but okay, fine, it was on Facebook, whatever it was. It was on FNN, Facebook News Network, whatever it is. But I saw a story of a Black woman who had gone to the hospital 3 different times because she was presenting with symptoms, and she wasn't admitted until she was barely able to breathe, and she ended up passing away, I believe. And so that plays into some of the historical, and yes, this is a common story that is happening to people where they're being turned away from ERs because of some of the greater issues of us not being prepared for this virus. But it hit this Black woman, and it's hitting and I think it's going to hit Black people in a way that just the typical systemic issues in the medical field, with Black people not being believed, with Black people being thought to be able to experience more pain, and have a higher pain threshold, et cetera, et cetera. Some of those systemic aspects of racism, we're going to see those still play out. racism doesn't just stop happening because there's a virus. If anything, whenever people are experiencing panic, whenever they're experiencing things that they are unsure of or uncertain of, it plays up, and it plays racism up. And of course, we could not have this conversation about COVID-19 without talking about the assault, the attack on Asian American communities, Chinese Americans specifically, but also Asian Americans, because people don't know how to tell Chinese people from like white people, don't know how, and I guess, people that aren't Asian, a lot of people don't know how to tell the various ethnicities and tribes and stuff within the peoples of Asia apart. And so those people are experiencing all kinds of discrimination. They're experiencing all kinds of harm just because they have certain facial features, just because their skin is a certain color. And so we can't just put that aside because white people are dying in the hospital right now. And it's not just white people who are dying, like I said, it's Black people too, but we can't just put that aside because all of a sudden there's this other issue. And really, I'll say this too, is that this is a tendency of whiteness, is to look at other issues, and it's to look at issues and to not see the intersection with racism or classism or sexism or poverty or heteronormativity or any of that stuff. It's like white people, white culture, whiteness only has bandwidth for one thing. And so we talk about kind of what's considered normal. And so for white people, all these other things, racism is just an appendix onto the epidemic. And we don't see how the epidemic is tied to racism and how the two things. So it can be easy to say, okay, well, let's put racism aside, but really we need to be thinking about racism. Now, this is something that I've been wrestling with even on my own public platform, is as a Black woman, how to talk about systemic racism, how to talk about interpersonal racism in light of COVID-19, because I'm not Asian, I'm not Asian American, I'm not a Pacific Islander. Nobody's ever going to mistake me as someone from any of those countries. And so there's a certain amount of privilege that I carry in right now. My ethnicity is not seen as a disease. I'm not seen as a virus. And so being able to speak to that experience, but also lift up own voices that have those experiences. So that's something that I've had to navigate on my public platform, while also because people aren't, I'm not an epidemiologist either. So people aren't coming to me to learn about a disease. People are coming to me to learn about racism and to hear about racism. So trying to pivot kind of what I'm talking about to be timely in terms of COVID-19, but also to not drown out own voices that are talking about that are Asian, that are talking about their experiences in light of the virus, but then also being able to talk about some of the systemic issues that are present within the virus, but then also recognizing that even though there's a virus and a lot of our world has stopped, white supremacy keeps trucking along, right? White supremacy keeps rolling along. It's like the army. Like no matter what, racism will keep rolling along. And my friend Jamar Tisby talks about how racism doesn't stop happening, it just adapts. And so now we're watching before our eyes, just as we're seeing this virus mutate, just as we're seeing because the virus exists because of a mutation. It's called novel coronavirus. I mean, coronaviruses have been around for forever, but this is a novel type of coronavirus that mutated, and now I think it was a zoonotic disease, and now humans are getting it. And that's just like it is with racism. Is like we're seeing in real time how racism is adapting and changing. We saw that after 9/11. After 9/11, or prior to 9/11, people who were from the Middle East, people who were Swana, so Middle East, Northern Africa, Southwest Asia. Swana, I think is Southwest Asia, North Africa, I think is what that abbreviation is. We were Swana people. were just seen, they weren't white, but some of them were amalgamated into whiteness. I mean, like the Kardashians. I mean, they
Yep.
are Armenian. A lot of my family, my mom had a friend whose husband was from Iran, I believe it was, and they just kind of lived as white people basically, and then 9/11 happens, and then all of a sudden those people aren't white anymore, and especially if they weren't Christian, they weren't white anymore. And so we watched racism adapt and change in real time after 9/11. And so we're seeing the same thing happen, how racism is adapting and changing in the midst of this virus. And so I think that those of us who take an anti-racism stance, we have to adapt and change the conversation to keep the conversation where for anti-racist. I mean, there's other things. You could talk about gender, you could talk about sexuality, you could talk about class, you could talk about ability. There's a lot of different kind of social justice issues that all intersect with this virus, and and so just because one of us some of us are talking about one thing, it doesn't mean that we don't recognize the whole. But this virus is a social justice issue, and so we have to adapt our social justice language, our social justice leanings, our platforms, our conversations to kind of fit in with the zeitgeist, and to be careful not to be late, like, like say this thing is gone in 6 months, or it's tamped down in 6 months, that then all of a sudden we're showing up like with all this coronavirus talk after. But we have to adapt and learn how to be relevant, and take some of these paradigms that we have been learning and have been honing in these last several years, and then apply it and figure out how it applies to this virus.
Yep. What would you say to churches that would plan to have in-person worship services on Easter?
Oh my gosh, don't do it. Like, just don't do it. I say that Easter is Good Friday is actually my favorite holiday. I know that's like an unusual favorite holiday to have, so I kind of always amalgamate it into Easter. I love Easter. I've been looking forward to this Easter. I recently was confirmed in the Episcopal Church, and I attend an Anglo-Catholic church that I'm not Catholic. It's not Catholic, but it is an amalgamation of the Anglican, the Episcopal tradition, and elements of Catholicism. It's a very beautiful experience. It's something that I never thought that I would really enjoy, but I definitely have enjoyed it. So I was looking forward to that, to kind of having my first Easter within that context. And so it's definitely disappointing, the prospect of not having that. But at the same time, I think that the whole of the gospel, the Jesus talks about how the law and the prophets hang on love. And so that's love for God, and that's love for your neighbor. And so the best way that we can love our neighbor right now is to limit our interactions with people. Is to not be present with people physically. And so I just don't think that it is advisable. I know that people might be like, oh, but we're going to step out on faith, or we're going to whatever, God's going to protect us, whatever. Listen, like I said, I was confirmed in the Episcopal Church, but I am Pentecostal and charismatic. I believe in miracles. I believe in the supernatural. I believe that God can do it, but also I believe in science. And the science is telling us right now, the models, the projections are telling us right now that despite whatever other figures within our government are saying, that things are probably not going to be okay for Easter. And we've seen in other countries where it just happened in China, specifically around Hong Kong, where all of these people who were returning to China because of the virus and whatever have brought it back with them. And so they're seeing another resurgence of the disease, where they were starting to get it under control, and they've been trying to get those people to stay in quarantine, and it's become a whole thing. It just seems like it would be so unnecessary. That sure, God could do this corporate miracle where nobody gets coronavirus. Every person who has it is asymptomatic and non-contagious, and every single person who worships, nobody who's attending a worship service in a church gets it. But Jesus also talks about tempting God, and I just kind of feel like that just showing up and just just being like, whenever we know that we could potentially get people sick, or we could potentially get sick, and you show up, that's tempting God. Like,
Yeah.
like that's like saying like, oh, I'm going to jump off the building and the angels are going to catch me.
Mm-hmm.
Like,
Mm-hmm.
I just don't think that
Yeah.
it is advisable. And I don't think that any church, that any leader, I think that if your church, if your leader, if you're anything is putting your conscience and hanging your faith and belief in Christ on whether or not you attend church on Easter, that's not a church, that's not a pastor, that is a cult, and you need to get out. And so I think that, and that's a bold statement, but I'm just saying that any person who meets, barring not just the CDC, but the World Health Organization, people like actual scientists who really don't have a stake in what happens in the church on Easter Sunday, like they're not going to see the money that happens that whenever the offering plate is passed. They're not going to get the prestige. They're not going to get the whatever, unless those people say, oh my goodness, this disease somehow has been eradicated in like the next 14 days. Oh my goodness, like it's a miracle. We can't explain this. Unless something like that happens and it's an across the board thing, I just think that we need to keep our eyes out.
Yeah.